"She's too fat to be my wife," the rich rancher declared, until the mountain man said, "She's perfect for mine." The summer sun hung low over Copper Ridge, Wyoming in 1884, beating down on the dusty street outside the town hall where the bride selection was taking place. 12 women from the east stood nervously in a line, each brought west by promises of marriage, land, and a better life. But as the wealthy men of the frontier circled them like buyers at a cattle market, those promises turned cruel. Among them stood Magnolia Maggie O'Brien, 25 years old, broad-shouldered, soft-faced, and weighing a little over 300 pounds. Her dress was clean but worn, the lace collar yellowed from travel. She kept her hands clasped tightly, praying someone, anyone, would see her heart before her body. But no one did. When the final selections were made, 11 women had been chosen. Only Maggie remained. At the front of the room, Cornelius Blackwood, Copper Ridge's wealthiest ranch owner, laughed aloud. "We can't all have perfection, gentlemen," he sneered, "but I'll be damned if I let a woman shaped like that ruin my family's good name." The crowd chuckled cruelly. One of the men whispered, "She'd sink a wagon if she sat in it." Laughter erupted. Maggie's throat burned, her vision blurred. She wanted to disappear into the floorboards. No one defended her. No one offered a kind word. The mayor awkwardly announced, "Well then, Miss O'Brien, I suppose." But before he could finish, the sound of hooves thundered outside. The laughter stopped. The saloon doors swung open, and a massive figure filled the doorway. Broad, tall, dressed in a long duster coated in mountain dust. His beard was dark as coal, his eyes a piercing glacial blue. Isaiah Zeke Thornfield, the reclusive mountain man of Devil's Peak, had arrived. He stepped into the silence, his voice a low rumble that cut through the air. "I heard there was a bride auction." Cornelius smirked. "You're too late, Thornfield. Only the leftovers remain." Zeke's eyes swept across the women until they found Maggie, standing alone, trembling, her chin lifted despite the tears in her eyes. His expression softened. "Then I suppose I came right on time." The crowd murmured as he walked toward her. "She's perfect for me," Zeke said simply. Maggie's breath caught. Her heart pounded in her chest. Cornelia scoffed. "You can't be serious. She's too fat to be anyone's wife." Zeke turned to him, gaze cold and steady. "She's too strong to be yours," he replied, "but just right for mine." The room went dead quiet, and for the first time in her life, Maggie O'Brien was chosen. The town of Copper Ridge whispered for days after the auction. The story of the mountain ghost who had descended from Devil's Peak to claim the woman everyone else rejected spread like wildfire. Some said Zeke Thornfield was a madman who'd once killed a bear with his bare hands. Others said he'd lost his wife and child in a fire and hadn't spoken to another living soul since. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain: he was a man no one dared cross. And now he was riding away with Magnolia O'Brien sitting behind him on his black stallion, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist, her heart pounding louder than the hooves beneath them. They rode in silence through the open plains, the sun dipping low behind the peaks. Maggie didn't dare speak. She was too afraid that if she did, he'd change his mind and send her back to town. When the silence finally broke, it was his voice, low, rough, but not unkind. "You hungry?" She hesitated. "A little, sir." "Name's Zeke," he said. "Not, sir. You'll get used to saying it." That made her blush. I didn't mean to make trouble back there, she whispered. You didn't have to. I don't do what I don't want to, he interrupted simply. She fell quiet again. As night fell, the trail narrowed into a winding path through the pine forests of Devil's Peak. When they finally reached his homestead, Maggie gasped softly. It wasn't a cabin. It was a fortress, a massive timber lodge built into the mountainside with thick walls, iron shutters, and a firelight glow that made it look almost like a castle in the wilderness. "This is home?" he said, dismounting. Maggie stared in awe. "You built all this?" "Every beam." Inside the lodge was warm and sturdy, rough-hewn wood, animal pelts, weapons mounted above the hearth. But there were also small signs of care, handmade furniture, a vase with dried flowers, and an empty cradle pushed into a corner, covered with a folded quilt. Zeke caught her gaze lingering on it, then turned away without a word. "That room's off limits," he said quietly. She nodded, understanding more than he realized. He lit a lantern, then handed her a blanket. "You can have the big room. I'll take the bunk near the fire." Maggie blinked. "You mean I'll sleep here, in the house?" He frowned. "Where else would you sleep? In the barn?" She lowered her head, embarrassed. "That's where they said women like me belong." His voice softened just a little. "Then it's time someone proved them wrong." For the first time in months, Maggie felt something stir inside her. Not fear, not shame, but the faintest spark of safety. She sat by the fire, eating the stew he'd set before her. When she dared glance at him, she found him watching quietly from across the room, as if trying to figure out what kind of creature fate had dropped on his doorstep. "You really think I'm perfect for you?" she asked softly, half afraid of the answer. Zeke's eyes held hers, steady as stone. "I don't think," he said. "I know." The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters, but inside that timber lodge, beneath the flicker of the fire, a wounded woman and a haunted man began the slow, quiet work of mending what the world had broken in them both. The next morning broke clear and cold, the peaks of Devil's Ridge glowing pink in the sunrise. The silence outside was the kind that only mountains knew, vast, ancient, humbling. Inside the timber fortress, the fire still burned low, filling the air with the scent of pine smoke and coffee. Maggie woke slowly, unsure for a moment where she was. Then it came back. The humiliation in Copper Ridge, the stranger's voice cutting through the laughter, the long ride into the wilderness. She sat up on the bed he'd given her, wide, clean, handmade, and looked around at the sturdy log walls. It was all real. When she stepped into the main room, Zeke was already awake. He stood near the door, loading rifles and packing supplies into his saddlebag. "You'll need boots," he said without looking at her. "The snow's still deep in the North Trail." I can't stay inside?" she asked. He shook his head. "You could, but you didn't look like the kind of woman who hides from hard work." Maggie's brow furrowed. "You don't know me, Mr. Thornfield." "Zeke," he corrected again, "and maybe I do." They left the cabin together, following the narrow trail that wound through the trees. The air was sharp, the snow crunching beneath their boots. Zeke's stride was steady, long, Maggie's slower, her breath visible in the cold air. But she refused to fall behind. After an hour, they reached a clearing that opened to a view so wide it made her stop in her tracks. Below them, the valley stretched endlessly. Forests, streams, sunlight breaking through clouds like gold on glass. Lord above, she whispered. It's beautiful. Zeke watched her quietly. That's why I stayed up here, he said. Down there, it's all greed and noise. Up here, a man can remember who he is. Maggie looked at him. The way the wind tugged at his dark hair, the way his jaw clenched as if holding back something heavy. And who are you, really? His answer came slowly. A man who's done enough wrong to know the cost of it. They walked again. Maggie carried what she could, bundles of wood, a small sack of cornmeal. When she stumbled, Zeke was there before she could fall, steadying her with one massive hand. I've got you, he said almost gruffly. Maybe I don't need catching, she muttered, embarrassed. He smirked, the faintest hint of warmth in his voice. Maybe you just needed someone to walk beside you. The words lingered between them like a fragile thread of light. When they returned to the lodge, Maggie insisted on cooking. She worked carefully in the kitchen, the smell of venison stew and herbs soon filling the room. Zeke sat nearby, watching her hands. Quick, sure, practiced. You cooked for a big family? He asked. Used to, she said softly. My father ran a small farm. Ma died when I was 13, so I learned to feed the men. Then the fever took them too. He nodded, not prying further. You learned to take care of yourself. I had to. She hesitated, then added, I don't think anyone ever took care of me back. Zeke's gaze darkened. Then they were fools. She froze at the words, not because of their sharpness, but because no one had ever said something like that for her. That night, as they ate by the fire, the silence between them felt softer, no longer awkward, but companionable. The storm outside picked up again, rattling the shutters. Maggie flinched at the sound, her old fears creeping in. Zeke noticed. You safe here? He said simply, his voice steady as the logs in the hearth. Nothing touches you under this roof. She looked at him, really looked. Beneath the scars, the roughness, the distance, there was something fierce, yet gentle, like the mountain itself, dangerous, but sheltering. Thank you, she whispered. He met her gaze, eyes flickering in the firelight. Don't thank me yet. This mountain tests everyone, but I reckon you'll pass. And in that flickering light, Maggie felt something she hadn't felt since she was a child, not just warmth, but worth. Weeks passed quietly on Devil's Peak. The world below turned green with spring, but up on the mountain, snow still clung to the shaded slopes, and the nights remained cold enough to make the windows frost. In that lonely fortress of timber and stone, two wounded lives began to learn what peace sounded like. Each morning, Zeke rose before dawn to chop wood or check traps, his breath white in the chill air. When Maggie first offered to help, he only gave her a doubtful look. You ever swing an axe before? No, she admitted, but I've hauled sacks of grain twice as heavy as that log, so unless your mountain's made of gold, I can manage. He almost smiled, a rare thing. We'll see. By noon, she'd split 3 logs and blistered both hands, but refused to stop. When she dropped the axe at last, Zeke wordlessly handed her a cup of water and said, Told you you'd manage. That night, he added quietly, Most folks who come up here quit before sunrise. I'm not most folks, she said, pride flickering through her exhaustion. I know, he replied. Life settled into a rhythm. Maggie learned the mountain secrets, how to find wild onions by scent, how to smoke meat so it lasted through storms, how to read Zeke's moods even when he said nothing. In return, she brought something into his life he hadn't known he missed: laughter. When he came back soaked from the rain, she scolded him with a grin and tossed him a blanket. "You look like a bear that lost its honey." He grunted, "Don't keep honey on me. Bears'll find it." "You are the bear," she teased. He stared at her for a moment, then gave a deep, unexpected laugh, a rough, rusty sound that startled even him. Maggie froze, then smiled softly. "Well, there it is. I wondered if you had one of those." The sound stayed with him long after she'd gone to bed. One evening, a storm rolled in without warning. Rain lashed the windows, and thunder shook the walls. Maggie jumped at each crack, old fears rushing back. She stood near the fireplace, wrapping her shawl around herself. Zeke noticed and set down his tools. "You all right?" "I've always hated storms," she admitted. "They remind me of the night my parents' farm burned. I still hear the wind in the fire sometimes." He stepped closer, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel the steadiness in him. "Ain't fire here," he said. "Ain't wind that'll hurt you. Just rain." Maggie nodded, blinking back tears. "Thank you." He hesitated. "When my wife died, I tore this house down to the bones and rebuilt it, every nail, every beam. Thought if I built it strong enough, nothing could break through again. Didn't figure someone might need to be let in." Her voice was soft. "You built walls to keep out pain, but you built them strong enough to keep out kindness too." For a long moment, their eyes held. Outside, lightning flashed against the mountains. Inside, the silence felt like something sacred. Zeke spoke first, his voice low. "You ever think maybe God sends people not to test us, but to remind us we're still worth saving?" She smiled faintly. "I think maybe He sent me up a mountain to remind someone else of that." He looked away, clearing his throat. "You should rest. Tomorrow I'll teach you to shoot." "Shoot?" She laughed, startled. "If you're living here, you'll need to defend it. Bears, wolves, or men who think they can take what ain't theirs." Something in his tone made her pause. The warmth of the moment shifted to something sharper, protective. She nodded slowly. "All right, teach me." The next morning, under a clear sky, he handed her a rifle. The wood gleamed in the light, and the metal felt heavy in her hands. "Don't fight the gun," he said gently, stepping behind her. His breath brushed her ear. "Let it speak when you're ready." She aimed, heart pounding, finger trembling. When the shot cracked through the air, a tin can 50 yards away spun off the fence post. Maggie gasped, lowering the rifle. "Did I?" Zeke smiled, pride flickering in his eyes. "Dead center." She turned to him, laughing, bright, free, unguarded. For a moment, the mountain felt alive again. And for the first time in years, Zeke Thornfield, the man who'd buried his heart under snow and silence, felt it beating again. Summer brought color to Devil's Peak. Wildflowers painted the slopes in purple and gold, and the river below the ridge ran fast with melted snow. For the first time in years, Zeke's homestead felt alive again, not just a fortress of wood and stone, but a home. Maggie woke each day before the sun, humming while she cooked breakfast. She filled the silence that once haunted the place with the rhythm of living, the sound of bread dough being kneaded, chickens clucking in the yard, and laughter that startled the ravens from the trees. But peace never lasted long in the frontier. One afternoon, Zeke rode into Copper Ridge to trade supplies. The moment he stepped into town, conversation stopped. Men at the saloon turned their heads. The bartender poured his drink without a word. At a corner table, Cornelius Blackwood watched him with a thin smile. His pride still burned from that day at the bride auction, the day the mountain man had embarrassed him in front of the whole town. "Well, if it isn't the hermit of Devil's Peak," Blackwood drawled. "How's your wife?" Zeke met his gaze, calm but cold. "Stronger than you'll ever be." The rancher's smile twitched. "Careful, Thornfield. A man like you shouldn't get too attached to a woman like that. Word is she's trapped up there. Poor thing. Maybe the sheriff should check on her." Zeke leaned across the table, his voice a low rumble. "You come up my mountain, you won't come back down." For a moment, the saloon went dead quiet. Then Zeke tossed a silver dollar onto the counter, turned, and walked out. Blackwood's eyes narrowed. He wasn't finished. That night, back on the mountain, Zeke said nothing about what he'd heard, but Maggie saw the way his shoulders stayed tense, the way his eyes kept scanning the horizon even after dark. "What happened in town?" she asked softly. He hesitated. "Blackwood's stirring trouble. He's telling folks I'm keeping you prisoner." Maggie's hand stilled. "That man humiliated me once. He'll do worse if he thinks he can." Zeke looked at her, jaw tight. "Then he'll learn what happens when a man mistakes mercy for weakness." She reached across the table, laying her hand over his. "Zeke, don't fight him with anger. That's what he wants." His voice softened. "You're not afraid?" "Of him?" she said, her chin lifting. "Not any more." He studied her face, the quiet fire in her eyes, the steel beneath the softness, and felt something tighten in his chest. "You've changed," he murmured. "Maybe," she said, smiling faintly. "Or maybe I just stopped believing the lies they told me about who I was." 2 days later, the lies came riding up the mountain with guns drawn. Blackwood's hired men, 6 of them, appeared at dawn, their horses kicking up dust and gravel. Maggie spotted them first from the tower window and shouted for Zeke. "They're coming!" He was already grabbing the rifle. "Get inside! Bar the door!" But Maggie didn't run. She climbed to the lookout and took aim, her hand steady despite the fear rising in her throat. When the men fired the first shot, she answered it. The crack of her rifle echoed across the cliffs, sending one of their hats spinning into the dust. Zeke fought like the mountain itself, silent, relentless, immovable. By midday, the men were retreating, 2 wounded and 1 left behind, to crawl back down the ridge. When the last of the gunfire faded, Maggie's knees nearly gave out. Zeke caught her before she fell, steadying her in his arms. "You all right?" he asked, breathless. She nodded, tears streaking her cheeks. "I told you I could fight for what's mine." He brushed a thumb across her face, rough hand, gentle. "You didn't fight for what's yours," he said quietly. "You fought for ours." That night, the fortress glowed warm with firelight. Maggie sat beside him on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, the stars wide above them. "You think he'll come back?" she asked. "Men like Blackwood don't stop until someone stops them for good," Zeke said. "But he'll have to climb a mountain first." She smiled faintly. "Then let him climb. I'll be waiting." Zeke turned to her, the firelight catching the edges of his face, scarred, strong, and full of something new. "You've got a warrior's heart, Maggie," he said softly. "They called you too big for a man's world. Turns out you're just big enough to fill it." Her eyes shone in the darkness. And you're not as cold as the world said either." He chuckled low. "Don't tell the mountain. It'll lose respect for me." She laughed, a warm, unguarded sound that carried into the night. And high above the town that once shamed her, Magnolia O'Brien sat beside the man who had seen her strength before she ever believed it herself. The fortress on Devil's Peak was no longer just a refuge. It was a declaration that love built in the wild could outlast any storm. For nearly 2 weeks after the first skirmish, the mountain held its breath. The trails stayed quiet, the air heavy with unease. Even the ravens that usually circled above Devil's Peak had vanished. Zeke knew silence like that didn't last. It meant a storm was coming, not of weather, but of men. He spent every day reinforcing the walls, stacking stone and timber around the outer gate. Maggie worked beside him without complaint, carrying buckets of nails, oiling the rifles, refilling cartridge belts. They spoke little, but the rhythm between them was unbroken, steady as the heartbeat of the mountain itself. Late one night, after Emma, the young orphan from a nearby valley they'd taken in, had gone to bed, Maggie found Zeke sitting by the window, cleaning his rifle in the dark. The lamplight caught the edge of the scar down his cheek. "You're waiting for him," she said quietly. He didn't deny it. "Blackwood doesn't take defeat kindly. He'll come with more men, and this time he'll mean to end it." She stepped closer, her voice calm. "Then we end it first." Zeke looked up, studying her. "You sure you want to fight again?" "I've fought my whole life," she answered. "Only difference is, now I have something worth protecting." The attack came at dawn. The sound of hooves shattered the morning silence, echoing off the ridges. From the watchtower, Maggie saw them coming, a dozen riders in Blackwood's colors, their rifles gleaming, their torches already lit. She ran to the courtyard. "They're here!" Zeke met her at the gate, eyes narrowed, voice calm. "Then we make them wish they'd stayed in town." The first shots rang out before the sun fully cleared the horizon. Bullets struck the wooden walls, splintering planks, but the fortress held firm. Zeke returned fire from the parapet, his rifle booming like thunder through the valley. Maggie, crouched beside him, reloaded quickly, her hand sure and steady. "Coming up the left ridge," she shouted. He swung around, dropped one rider clean from his saddle. "Good eye," he said. Smoke filled the air, the smell of gunpowder mixing with pine and cold. The men below cursed and yelled, but the mountain gave them no mercy. Blackwood himself appeared near the front shouting orders. He wore a fine black coat, dusted with snow, and his fury was visible even from a distance. "You think you can hide behind your walls, Thornfield?" he roared. "You're a dead man when this is over." Zeke stood tall atop the gate, his voice carrying over the gunfire. "You'll have to climb to kill me, Blackwood. The mountain won't let you leave." Blackwood raised his revolver, firing blindly. One bullet grazed Maggie's arm, tearing through her sleeve. She gasped, but stayed on her feet. "Maggie!" Zeke dropped beside her, checking the wound. "It's nothing," she hissed. "I've had worse burns in a kitchen. Keep fighting." He hesitated just long enough to see the fire in her eyes, and then nodded. "All right, let's finish this." By noon, the attackers began to falter. Their torches had burned out, and their ammunition was running low. The fortress walls still stood, smoke curling from their surface like battle scars. Zeke spotted Blackwood retreating toward the tree line and went after him. Maggie shouted after him, "Zeke, don't!" But he was already gone. The two men met halfway down the slope, one carrying a revolver, the other a rifle, and a lifetime's worth of pain. Blackwood fired first, the shot echoing off the cliffs. It missed. Zeke didn't fire back immediately. He stepped closer, his voice low and steady. "You could have stopped, Blackwood. You could have walked away and let the mountain forget your name." The rancher sneered. "You think a dirt-born hermit and his cow of a wife are going to outlive me? You're nothing." Zeke raised his rifle. "No, but she is everything you'll never be. Honest, brave, and free." The final shot rang out like thunder over Devil's Peak. When the smoke cleared, Blackwood lay still in the snow. By the time Zeke climbed back to the fortress, Maggie was waiting at the gate, arm bandaged, cheeks streaked with soot. The moment she saw him, her breath caught. "It's over," he said simply. She ran to him, her eyes bright with relief. "You're hurt," she whispered, touching the blood on his sleeve. He smiled faintly. "Not as bad as the mountain." Maggie laughed softly, tears slipping down her face. "You stubborn, impossible man." He took her hand and kissed her knuckles, rough lips brushing over the scars and powder burns. "And you, Maggie O'Brien, are the bravest woman I've ever known." For a long moment, neither spoke. The fortress stood silent around them, the air thick with smoke and victory. Finally, Maggie whispered, "We built this place to survive, but I think we just learned how to live." Zeke nodded. "And no one will ever take that from us again." Above them, the clouds began to break. Sunlight spilling across the valley, the fortress of Devil's Peak stood strong, a monument not to power, but to love that refused to be broken. When the gun smoke cleared, peace returned to the mountain in slow breaths. For the first time in weeks, the only sounds around the fortress were the rush of the river below and the soft creak of the pines in the wind. The people of Copper Ridge came up the mountain days later, drawn by stories that had already spread through the saloon and the church pews. The tale was unbelievable, that a rich rancher and his hired guns had been defeated by a mountain man and the woman he once called too fat to be anyone's wife. When they arrived, they found the fortress still standing, scarred but proud. Zeke greeted them without boasting. Maggie stood beside him, her arms still bound, her chin high. She didn't hide behind him or bow her head in shame. She stood like a woman who had faced death and found herself stronger for it. Sheriff Williams dismounted first, his hat in his hand. "We found Blackwood's body," he said quietly, "and a ledger in his coat, land deeds, forged signatures, bank withdrawals, everything we needed." Zeke nodded once. "He won't trouble anyone else." The sheriff glanced between them. "You both could have run, you know. No one would have blamed you." Maggie smiled faintly. "We don't run from where we belong." That single sentence, spoken calmly without pride, rippled through the gathered townsfolk like a confession and a revelation at once. For the first time, they looked at her not with ridicule, but with respect. An old woman from the mercantile stepped forward, clutching her shawl. "Miss O'Brien," she said softly, "I was there that day at the auction. I laughed with the rest. I shouldn't have." Maggie blinked, surprised. "That day's done," she said kindly. "We all have to live with who we were. I'd rather live with who I am now." The woman nodded, tears filling her eyes. Zeke rested a hand on Maggie's shoulder, pride shining quietly in his gaze. As summer ripened into autumn, the fortress on Devil's Peak changed again. The bullet holes were patched, the broken gates replaced. Zeke built an extra wing, not for defense, but for welcome. "We've got more space than we'll ever use," he said one morning. "Might as well make it mean something." Maggie looked up from the porch, her needle paused mid-stitch. "Mean something?" He nodded. "There are women in town with nowhere to go, widows, girls turned out with no kin, wives running from men like Blackwood. They need a place to start again." Her eyes softened. "A home on the mountain," she murmured. "A place the world can't laugh them out of." He smiled. "Exactly that." And so the haven of Devil's Peak was born, a refuge where women could learn to live free, to work, to defend themselves. Maggie taught them what Zeke had taught her, how to shoot straight, mend fences, and hold their ground. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, she'd catch Zeke watching her from the doorway, that same half-smile tugging at his mouth. "What?" she'd tease. He'd shrug. "Just trying to figure out how the world ever thought you were anything less than magnificent." She'd blush and throw a towel at him. "You're a terrible flatterer, Isaiah Thornfield." "Not flattery," he'd say, "just truth." The first snow of the season came early that year. The mountain was blanketed in white again, but the fortress glowed warm from within, light spilling from the windows, laughter echoing through its halls. In the courtyard, Maggie stood wrapped in a thick shawl, watching as the women hung lanterns along the walls. Zeke came up behind her, his hand settling gently around her waist. "You've turned this old fortress into a home," he said quietly. "We built it together," she corrected. "You gave it walls. I gave it a heartbeat." He chuckled softly. "Fair trade." For a long moment they stood in silence, looking out over the valley where the snow fell in soft spirals. "I used to think I was too much for love," Maggie said. "Too loud, too big, too broken. But you looked at me and saw a woman who could survive a mountain." Zeke kissed her temple. "You didn't just survive it. You became it." And under the first snow of winter, high above the town that once shamed her, Maggie O'Brien and Isaiah Thornfield began a new chapter, not of endurance, but of joy. The mountain, once a place of exile, had become their sanctuary, proof that even the hardest hearts and the harshest lands could grow something beautiful if tended with courage and kindness. Every mountain holds two kinds of people, those who climb to conquer it and those who climb to be changed. Magnolia O'Brien never set out to conquer anything. She only wanted to be seen, to be loved, to belong. But the climb up Devil's Peak taught her something far greater. That strength doesn't come from being admired. It comes from surviving what others think you can't. Once, the world pointed and laughed at her, called her too big, too plain, too unworthy. Now that same world whispered her name with reverence, because when no one else believed, she did not break. She built. She built a home on the side of a mountain where no one dared live. She built a place where broken souls could rest. And she built a love strong enough to silence every cruel word ever spoken about her. Zeke Thornfield had spent a decade hiding from life, convinced the world had taken everything that mattered. But in Maggie, he found the one thing worth coming down from the mountain for, not pity, not peace, but purpose. Together, they proved that even in the loneliest corners of the frontier, love still finds its way, not dressed in perfection, but in courage. So if you're listening to this story somewhere far away, maybe in a quiet room, maybe on a lonely road, remember this: you are never too much to be loved. You are never too broken to begin again. And you are never too late to find your mountain. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Because every story like this, of strength, of redemption, of love that defies the world, reminds us that no matter how far apart we are, our hearts still hear the same call: to stand tall, to fight for kindness, to open the door for someone who's been left outside too long. If you still believe in that kind of love, the kind that sees beauty where others see weakness, then don't leave just yet. The next story is already waiting for you, somewhere in the wind between the pines.